Nebraska 3, Purdue 2, Nebraska 154, Northern Iowa 86, Nebraska West Virginia 47-16, Nebraska 46-53, Nebraska 3, Purdue 1, Ohio State 56, Nebraska 14, Nebraska 1, Indiana 1, Nebraska 0, Iowa 0, Nebraska Ida Central Regional Championships, Nebraska Bellevue University, Nebraska Northwestern, Nebraska Army, West Point, Nebraska Iowa State, Nebraska Northwestern Illinois, Nebraska Mississippi State, Quail Valley Collegiate Invitational, Nebraska Nebraska Coaches Clinic, Intra-Squad Wrestle-Offs, Nebraska Michigan State, Nebraska Purdue Big Ten Tournament Quarterfinals, Nebraska Memphis, Nebraska Michigan Husker Hoops Preview, Nebraska Big Ten Tournament Semifinals, Nebraska Arkansas Purdue, Nebraska Northwestern, Nebraska Kansas, Indiana, Nebraska Big Ten Tournament Finals, Nebraska Warren Williamson Daktronics Open, Minnesota State, Mankato, Nebraska Northwood, Michigan, Nebraska Maryland, Nebraska Minnesota Invitational Diving Only, Nebraska Eastern Illinois, Nebraska Minnesota Big Ten Dual Meet Challenge, Nebraska Southern Illinois Edwardsville, Nebraska Rutgers, Nebraska North Texas, Nebraska UMKC, Nebraska St. John's, Arkansas, Nebraska Ohio State, Nebraska Wyoming, Nebraska Penn State, Nebraska Kentucky Air Force, Ohio State NCAA Championships, Nebraska Maryland, North Dakota, Nebraska Creighton, Nebraska Northwestern Buffalo, Nebraska UCF, Nebraska Coastal Carolina, Nebraska Iowa, Nebraska West Virginia, Iowa, Nebraska TBA, Nebraska USA Swimming Winter Nationals, Nebraska Boston College, Nebraska Clemson, Nebraska Cliff Keen, Las Vegas Collegiate Wrestling Invitational, Arkansas Pine Bluff, Nebraska Michigan State, Minnesota, Nebraska Kansas, Nebraska Creighton, Nebraska Drake, Nebraska North Carolina State, Nebraska Kansas, Nebraska San Jose State, North Carolina, Nebraska Florida Atlantic, Nebraska UTSA, Nebraska